Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 8 of my Mean Streets of Gadgetzan card review. This time around I've just got a smattering of cards, some class cards, neutral cards, but actually a few pretty interesting and what I think are going to be good ones as well. So let's go ahead and jump right in to the first card up for review. It is one last Grimy Goons card I guess I skipped or didn't quite make the cut in past reviews, and this is the Grimscale Chum, a Paladin class card, 1 mana, 2/1. It's a Murloc and has a very nice battle cry. You have a random Murloc in your hand, +1/+1. So this really wouldn't work in a typical neutral, non-tribal Grimy Goons style deck, just because clearly its buff is limited specifically to Murlocs. But I have a feeling that in a Murloc specific, really aggressive, so not a traditional Murloc Paladin that's a late game anything can happen style deck, but instead a buff-oriented aggressive Murloc deck with lots of low-cost cards that just looks to build an insane Murloc board. This is the kind of card that could be perfect for that, because there's already so many Murloc synergy cards with buffs, Grimy Goon cards that buff everything in your hand available to Paladin already. So essentially you're going to have a whole helping of Murlocs mixed in with some neutral minions as well, or at least non-tribal minions as well. And essentially you're going to be able to build really big Murlocs. And of course the problem with Murlocs right now in an aggressive sense is that, yeah, you can sometimes get that dream opener where you get, I'm not going to know all the names of every Murloc because there's like a bajillion, but essentially you build into a curve where each subsequent Murloc that hits the board actually buffs the previous one, whether it's buffing an attack, adding some health. Eventually you get the War Leader down and an entire wide board of Murlocs is buffed in a very substantial way. This just contributes to that mentality and gives you more options, so that sometimes if you play a naked Murloc out on the board on its own, instead of being a really weak, understated card that's relying on on-board aura synergies, suddenly it's finally statted adequately for its cost, which means it's just going to be stronger, be able to live, stick around, and be sticky for the next round of buffs that are going to hit. So hand buffs, in a way, open up a whole new door to me as far as aggressive Murloc decks are concerned, because you're finally getting the value you need out of individual minions as well. So a card like Grimscale Chum sort of takes that Murloc aggressive playstyle, fuses it with a Grimy Goons hand buff playstyle, and becomes the focal point that makes a lot of sense. That is an archetype that could certainly work in my mind. I don't know why on earth Blizzard wants to push Murlocs onto Paladins specifically, but hey, I don't hate it. I'd like to see it in action. I think it could be a halfway decent deck. So Grimscale Chum, ultimately as its own minion in a vacuum, is probably just average at best, because you know it's a very specific conditional buff. It's a 2/1 body for 1 mana, which is never bad. That part's fine. So an average minion that really, though, becomes potentially exceptional just because of the doors it opens and the kinds of decks it might enable with an aggressive Murloc Paladin. So actually a pretty interesting and potentially powerful card despite being only 1 mana. So let's go ahead and move on to the next few cards. These kind of go together. I don't know what exactly you'd call them. The motorcycle gang, I guess, of the Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. There's the Leatherclad Hog Leader, the Tanaris Hog Chopper, and the Spiked Hog Rider. So I guess we'll call this the Hog Gang. All three of these cards have similar mechanics in that there's some condition, and if that condition is met, then when they hit the board, they have charge. So conditional chargers. But unfortunately, I don't really think any of them are all that good. One potentially is okay. So let's go ahead and jump into them individually. Up first is the Leatherclad Hog Leader. 6 mana, 6/6. And there's another 6 here. If your opponent has 6 or more cards in hand, gain charge. So this only works against what would presumably be pretty control-oriented decks that have not utilized a lot of cards, or at least have drawn a lot of cards by turn 6. So then at that point you get a pretty big body that also just gets to attack instantly. So what use cases for this are there? Like, what decks does this fit into? And it's really hard to think about it that way. I think that all three of these cards have to be thought of as almost tech cards, cards that are designed to counter something specific that's happening in the meta. This one being a counter to, as I mentioned, late game, greedy, control-oriented decks that like to hoard resources and play a little slower. But even in that world, right, like often just being able to charge and do 6 damage right away isn't all that powerful. Like, yeah, you could hit their face for 6. Yeah, you could clear a minion instantly. But it's very unlikely that your opponent wouldn't have an answer to this card rather rapidly in that kind of environment when they already have so many cards and so many resources and probably a lot of removal based on the kind of deck that they're playing. That I don't really know that Leatherclad Hog Leader gives you a huge advantage. It could sort of pseudo be something like a Doom Guard if you're playing an aggressive deck that needs some sort of top-end finisher piece or just a really strong minion. So Doom Guard is clearly a great card. This falls in line there, but it's a little bit more expensive. It's actually a little easier to kill. The attack value is not that significant. Clearly, it doesn't have the downside of Doom Guard's Battlecry discarding cards, but also this Battlecry doesn't always go off, so sometimes it's worse than a Boulder Fist Ogre. So ultimately, probably worse than Doom Guard in many ways, but it's kind of maybe a neutral Doom Guard almost, and just that's the only utility it serves. That said, I still don't actually think this card is reliable enough or strong enough to make the cut, and I don't really think this is going to be a sufficient answer for aggro to mid-range decks to counter a more control-style meta. I just don't think it works, and it's not necessarily a bad card, maybe just a tad below average, but not a functional one that will be played. So let's go ahead and move on to the next Hog dude. This time it's the Tanaris Hog Chopper, 4 mana, 4/4. This one is awful. It's the worst of the 3 in my opinion. Leatherclad Hog Leader is probably okay in some instances, as I mentioned. This one I don't think will ever be played because the condition on this is just so specific and so hard to accomplish. If your opponent's hand is empty, gain charge. So how often have you played against an opponent with a totally empty hand? Yeah, occasionally a hyper-aggressive face deck will empty out their hand, but it's not often by turn 4, so this is going to come in an awkward spot in the curve probably. And even if it does, what does a 4/4 charging minion actually accomplish? Yeah, it might kill one of the 7 minions they've played, right? So the condition here is just so rare, and even when the condition is met and this does get charged, the impact of this card is so low that I just don't see how this ever gets played. Yes, it's a tech answer to hyper aggressive metas, but it's not even a good one at that. If it also had taunt, like maybe it helps a little more, but I still think it'd be far too bad to ever be played. I think the Sonars Hog Chopper is actually rather awful, except maybe it's halfway not awful in Arena, but beyond that, in constructed play, this guy is a hard pass. So let's move on to the final Hog Rider. This one is maybe the best of them all as far as I'm concerned, but still probably not good enough to regularly find its way into decks. The Spiked Hog Rider 5 mana 5/5. Its Battlecry is much easier to meet as a condition. This is if an enemy minion has taunt, gain, charge. So there's a lot more taunt minions in play and more often than conditions like an empty hand or a hand with 6 or more cards. This one's not that hard to meet, but this one's like impossible to meet. But this one is something that could happen rather often. But again, the problem is I just don't know that you're really getting enough out of this card even when your enemy minion has taunt. So, Druid of the Claw is a really powerful card, undeniably, when you can charge it or taunt it. But is that 5 mana 4/4 charge really just ridiculously overpowered? No, not at all. And is adding a +1/+1 to that going to make it ridiculously overpowered? No, not at all, especially if it only works half the time. So when you compare this to other cards that are similar to it in many ways, it just doesn't stand out. It's, again, probably not any better than the Doom Guard, even when the condition is met. In fact, because it has less health, it might be worse than the Doom Guard, depending on the style of deck you're playing and how full or empty your own hand may be. So this one's definitely the best, in my opinion, but still lacks something and just lacks the strength or decisiveness or impact of a card that you might want in the 5 mana slot. So Spiked Hog Rider Probably won't make the cut either, but certainly looks better than his brothers and sisters in arms here, the other Hog gang members. So this one, this might fit occasionally if there's a really taunt heavy meta, or there is a hyper aggressive deck that needs a charge that's particularly good at clearing out taunts for a board to push through for lethal. So let's go ahead and move on to the non-Hog Rider minions. Up first is a new mage spell. It is the Volcanic Potion, a 3-mana spell that does 2 damage to all minions. Now that means, of course, all minions on your opponent's side of the board and your own, which is a little bit unfortunate because I really don't feel like this card is great for mage necessarily. I just don't know what it's supposed to do. Mage already has some pretty efficient ways to deal with an enemy's board. Those typically come later in the game with cards like Flame Strike, but right now we've seen Tempo Mage very successful utilizing Flame Waker to just chip away eventually at your opponent's board with lots and lots and lots of pings with things like Arcane Missiles or Arcane Blast. So I don't often see Mage falling so far behind on board that there are like a dozen little tiny minions out there that are risking your life, because there's just so many different ways with Frostbolts and Arcane Blasts and Arcane Missiles and eventually the big Flame Strikes and Blizzards that Mage typically can keep up with a board, in my opinion. I mean, ultimately, this almost feels like a Shaman counter to me in many ways, just because it's going to be very good at dealing with lots and lots of little totems, including those that have already been buffed by the Thunderbluff Valiant. So, beyond that, beyond an answer to a dominant Shaman meta, I don't really know that Mage is gonna absolutely adore this card. It's gonna be fine sometimes when it comes off the Kabbalist Tomes or the Babbling Book, and you need something that chips away at a board to help you finish it off. It would also be great with Flame Waker to some extent, although of course you're going to hurt your own Flame Waker and your own minions with this card, which is of course the downside. When I compare this to something like Hellfire available to Warlocks, it feels considerably worse to me. It's 1 less damage, which means it kills less things. It's 1 less mana, of course, you can cast it a little sooner, but of course when you're doing things like board clears, sometimes waiting that extra turn for your opponent to play an extra minion or 2 is actually an advantage, because it gives you more stuff to kill with a single card, increasing your efficiency and burning through their resources a little better too. So doing it early sometimes can be a waste, just because you spend that turn. It sort of just operates as a heal instead of actually taking care of your opponent's resources, because you're just killing things a turn sooner to save a little bit of your own health against that aggressive early push, as opposed to actually dealing with everything, because you're still going to have to deal with the minions they play the following turn on turn 4. So cards like Hellfire that are just a little bit slower but also kill bigger things can serve a wider purpose on wider boards in particular. Not to mention, a card like Hellfire also actually hits the opponent's face, so sometimes it can help you secure lethals. I'm sure you've all played Warlock decks, particularly Reno or Handlock decks, where you just got lethal off of Hellfire. You were able to kill your opponent with that extra 3 damage. So this lacks that utility as well. So in the end, this just feels like it's sort of unflexible, limited utility card to me. Granted, board clears are always good. Even small ones traditionally have been fantastic. Stuff like Maelstrom Portal, for instance, for Shaman, even though it only does 1 damage, it's still widely utilized. And this clearly also gets better with spell damage, but if you are playing a spell damage minion, there's a good chance you're going to kill your own spell damage minion as well. So I don't really love this card. It seems to fill an awkward slot. It's going to be okay if you get it off of other cards that generate spells. And it might be fine in decks like Reno Mage or Kazakus Mage, as we may come to call it, that only want 1 copy of a card and just need to fill in some value slots, particularly in the early game, to help keep up. But in the end, just an average card at best, I think, and perhaps even below average in many ways. I don't think this one's going to feel overpowered or dominant in any way. But I should note that the next card on this review, the Cabal Chemist, one of the tri-class cards available to Mage, Priest, and Warlock specifically, has a pretty interesting battle cry. Add a random potion to your hand. So Volcanic Potion presumably is one of those potions, along with a handful of other potions that have already been revealed, and perhaps even more that are coming soon. So this will be added into this particular card's pool of options, which, that might be all right, but clearly, even with Cabal Chemist, this is a battle cry that adds the potion to your hand. It's not casting it instantly or anything, so this is sort of just a random card draw effect from a very small pool of cards that on average I think aren't that good. This potion, as I mentioned, is not that amazing, and some of the potions we've seen before, particularly available to Priest, weren't that good, so assuming the Priest cards are also in this card's pool, as they should be since this is a tri-class card, I think this battle cry on Cabal Chemist is going to be fairly weak on average. Not every potion is going to do the specific thing you need at the moment, and typically those potions are going to have a pretty low return on investment. In other words, you're giving up a fair bit of stats on a 4-drop playing a 3/3 instead of something like a 4/5 just to get a card that may or may not be useful, and in fact, even if it is useful, may not do enough to really make an impact given the tempo you're sacrificing to play the Cabal Chemist itself. So yes, you could consider this something like the Tomb Spider. It's a very similar card in design. Draw card, 3/3 body, 4 mana. But unfortunately, it's not a discover effect or anything, so you're not like getting to pick a card. It's not a specific set things like a beast where you know that a beast is going to necessarily have synergy with your deck if that's the way your deck is designed. So the restrictions and limitations here on Cabal Chemist seem to make it worse to me in many ways. It is sort of a high value card, right? It's generating an extra resource for you, so there is some value bundled in, which is something that is advantageous to decks like Reno or Kazakus Mage because they really want the game to last, and the more cards they can generate as opposed to put in their deck just gives them more answers and more options. So it's definitely playable, the Cabal Chemist, but not ultimately an awesome card either. I think merely average in many ways. So let's move on to actually what is the final card in this review. I only had 7 cards queued up this time. This is a card that I absolutely adore. I think this card is awesome. This card is stupidly good in a variety of ways. This is the Warlock Minion, the Abyssal Enforcer. It's a 7 mana 6/6, which already, that's not too bad, right? 6/6s are giant bodies. So it's a demon as well, and occasionally demon synergies might matter, although not typically, but that's a small upside. And the battle cry is really what makes this card so darn good. Compared to a card like Dread Infernal, which is a 6 mana 6/6 that does 1 damage to all of the characters, the Abyssal Enforcer only costs 1 additional mana, but does 3 damage to all other characters. So essentially, this in many ways is a 3 mana 6/6. Because think about the card Hellfire. We already talked about it. Hellfire is a 4 mana spell that does 3 damage to all other characters. That's bundled in to Abyssal Enforcer. That 4 mana spell, which is widely played. It's a great card. It's good at 4 mana. It's bundled into this guy. It's going to do the exact same thing as Hellfire, but you also get a 6/6 minion. So for only 3 additional mana, you're getting a 6/6 card. That, folks, is awesome. Particularly in any mid to late game Warlock style deck. Clearly you're not going to run this in Zoo because you decimate your own board. But Reno Lock, Hand Lock style is going to love this card, because you don't have to essentially run a Hellfire if you don't want to, or you can run 2 Hellfires, which is probably even more likely because you're going to have the original Hellfire and the Abyssal Enforcer, so it just gives you a lot of options. So sometimes this is just practically a Flame Strike on your opponent's board that kills everything. Sometimes it's lethal damage on the opposing hero. In Reno-style Warlock decks, you're not traditionally having a ton of minions of your own, so there's very little exposure of this killing your own stuff or killing you, since you have so many defensive options and heals and stuff. So Abyssal Enforcer is just an insane, stupidly high value card that bundles a ton of stuff into a single draw, and for 7 mana you're getting so much back. This is a fantastic constructed card, and I would say arguably just an outstanding arena card as well, right? Because board clears in arena are powerful. This is the ultimate swing card as far as if your opponent's way ahead on the board not only do you get a big minion, but you're also going to kill a ton of stuff. So in both Constructed and Arena, every format, this guy is an absolute monster. Plus it's a common, so it's going to show up in Arena rather often, which is kind of scary for everybody that's not a Warlock. Abyssal Enforcer is just awesome, fantastic. It will definitely see play, and it's going to be frustrating to play against because this is a very, very dominating card. So I absolutely love it, A+. Awesome card. One of the, frankly, best in the set, I would say so far. I think this thing's going to be outstanding. Just fantastic. So, that actually wraps it up for my review part 8. In the end, we've got, this is a pretty solid card, weak card, terrible card, weak card, probably an average card, probably an average to weak card, and an absolutely just absurdly amazing card. So I'm curious what you guys think about these cards. I'm sure I missed some synergies. I'm sure I didn't see something I was supposed to see. I'm confident you're going to tell me that I got it all wrong. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments or any insights that you can offer on these cards, what decks you'd like to play them in, all that fun stuff. I'd like to thank you for watching, and until next time, game on.